Hi everyone, it's Carissa. Today I wanted to talk to you about two very similar techniques that are typically used when knitting socks or mittens, but I've used them in a rather unexpected way in an upcoming shawl design. So I wanted to show you how I adapted this for a shawl. So the first technique I'm going to talk about is an afterthought heel or an afterthought thumb if you're making a mitten. Say you're knitting a pair of socks for a friend and you don't know exactly how long their foot is, so where to put the heel. You can make a tube sock with no heel, either from the cuff down or the toe up. It works either direction. You can knit a tube sock with no heel and then go back later and figure out where your heel should go and open up a hole in your tube sock to add that heel as an afterthought. Similarly, if you're making a mitten, say it's a Fair Isle mitten with a lot of color work and you don't want to interrupt that color work with a thumb hole, well, you can just knit a mitten with no thumb and then go back later and add the thumb hole as an afterthought. So, say this swatch is part of a sock or part of a mitten. What I'm going to do is use a needle that is a couple sizes smaller than what I knit my swatch with. And I'm going to use that needle to pick up a partial row of stitches. And then I'm going to use a second needle to pick up a partial row of stitches 2 rows up. And between those 2 rows of picked up stitches, I'm actually going to pull that yarn out to make a hole for my heel or my thumb. So if we look at each knit stitch here that looks like a V, I'm going to use my needle to pick up the right hand leg of each V. And I'm just going to do maybe 7 or 8 stitches here across 3, 4, 5, 6, just picking up the right leg of each of those stitches, of each of those V's. And if you're knitting a sock, the number of stitches that you're going to pick up is going to be about half the total circumference of the sock. If you are making an afterthought thumb on a mitten, it's probably going to be maybe 6 to 8 stitches. It really depends on your gauge, of course, but just the width of your thumb. So I've picked up my stitches here. I picked up 8 of them. I'm going to grab my second needle. Again, it's a couple sizes smaller than what I made my swatch with, just so it's easier to pick up those stitches. I'm going to skip the row of stitches just above this first needle, and I'm going to pick up stitches 2 rows up with the second needle. And I'm going in the same column as this first stitch that I picked up. So this V right here, I'm going to pick up the right hand leg of that. And then again, next to it, the next stitch, there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So I've picked up 8 stitches on each needle, and they're the same, they're the same 8 stitches. They're all lined up with each other. And there's a row of stitches in between that I have not touched. So what I'm going to do next is take my scissors, and I'm going to very carefully try to sort of stretch this apart, and I'm going to snip the thread of that row in between. Just snip it. And then I can use another needle to just pick that yarn out. And you want to snip it roughly in the middle of the stitches you picked up. So since I picked up 8 stitches, I want to snip the yarn about 4 stitches in from each side. And then I'm just going to use this third needle to pick out that yarn. Go. And one more. Oh, actually not one more. No, yes, one more. Go. Okay, and then come and pull out the other side of it as well. And that last stitch. Okay, and I'm just gonna push those tails to the wrong side of my work through the hole, and those will get woven in the end. So this tail here at this end, this one at this end, they'll get woven in after I've done my heel or my thumb. So now, and you typically want to, you'll typically want to pick up one more stitch on each end, because if I just started knitting around on these stitches for my heel or my thumb, I might end up with a little gap on each end. So what I'm going to do with each needle is to go back and just pick up one stitch between the two needles right there, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to rotate it, and again I want to pick up a stitch on this end between the two needles, so I'm just going to pick up that loop right there. So now I have all of my stitches on my needle. I've snipped the yarn and opened up a hole for my thumb or my heel. So I'll just distribute this to more DPNs or to circular needles or magic loop, however you like to work small circumference projects in the round. And you'll knit your heel or your thumb, and that'll be that. And you'll weave in your ends and block your project, and you'll be done. Now, so the next technique that I want to talk to you about is called the peasant heel or peasant thumb, I suppose. And it's very similar to the Afterthought heel or thumb, but I've already decided ahead of time when I'm knitting the sock or the mitten or the swatch in this case, I already know where my heel or my thumb is going to go. So I can put waste yarn in at that row. And then when I go back, I pick up the stitches under it, I pick up the stitches above it, and then I don't have to use my scissors to snip that yarn and remove those stitches. I can just remove the waste yarn, and then I haven't had to cut my real yarn, my purple yarn here. So how to insert that waste yarn. I've got another swatch in progress here, and I've reached the point where I know my heel or my thumb should go. So I'm going to start knitting this row just like normal, and I'm going to knit about, let's say 6 stitches. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And now this is where my thumb or my heel is going to go. So I'm going to grab some waste yarn, and I'm going to knit the next 8 stitches using this waste yarn instead of my working yarn. So add the yellow here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That looks good. Now I want to continue the row in the row with my working yarn again. But wait, my working yarn is attached way over here. I don't want to just pull it across and start knitting with it, because then I'm going to have this string across the back. What I want to do instead is to slip each of these waste yarn stitches back to my left hand needle, not twisting them, just slipping them from right to left all the way back until I get to the point where the purple yarn stopped. And I'm going to re-knit those same 8 stitches with my working yarn now instead of my waste yarn. So those stitches will get knitted twice on this row, once with the waste yarn and then again with the working yarn. So I'll knit all the way across those waste yarn stitches, and then keep working across the row until I finish that out. There we go. So now I've inserted that waste yarn, a partial row where my heel or my thumb will go. So I can just keep going, keep knitting my swatch or my sock or my mitten, and then come back and do my heel or my thumb afterward. So when it's time to come back and do that thumb or that heel, again, I'm going to pick up the stitches below the waste yarn and above the waste yarn, just like I did with my Afterthought heel, except that I have already marked where exactly I want that heel to go. So for each of the purple stitches below the yellow waste yarn, I'm going to pick up the right hand leg of each purple stitch. And I've already showed you this method, so let's look at another method for picking up those stitches instead. I can do it from the wrong side as well, and this might be a little bit easier to visualize for some people. So you can see the purl bumps at the bottom and the top of my waste yarn row, and then you can see the purple purl bumps at the top of the row below the waste yarn and the ones at the bottom of the row above the waste yarn. So I'm going to use my needles again to pick up each of those purl bumps from above. So I'm going to go down through that first purl bump below the waste yarn, and then down to the next purl bump, 3 and 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So I've picked up each of the purl bumps at the bottom of the waste yarn. And now I'm going to rotate my work and use my second needle, and this is right up against this first needle that I used, so it might be a little bit difficult. Sometimes I like to fold my work in half at that point, and it just makes that second row of purl bumps a little bit easier to get to. So again, I'm going to go down through each of those purl bumps. 1, 2, oh, I got some yellow yarn there, split the plies. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There we go. So I've picked up each of the purl bumps above and below the waste yarn, and this accomplishes the same thing as picking up the right legs of the yarn from the right side. You can pick up the purl bumps from the underside. And just like with the Afterthought heel, we want to remove that waste yarn. Instead, with the Afterthought heel, we were actually snipping the row in between the two needles and pulling that out. So this time we just have waste yarn to remove. It's a little more obvious which stitches we need to remove, and we don't actually have to cut our yarn to do so. I'm just going to use a third needle here to remove those stitches. And sometimes it can be a little difficult if your yarn is a little grabby, if it's not a super smooth, slick yarn. It might be a little challenging to pull out. There we go. Almost there. There we are. And now this is going to make it a little bit challenging because, as you can see, I picked up my stitches from the wrong side of the fabric, so my needles are underneath my fabric here. So what I'm going to do is flip it over again. I'm going to slide my needles almost all the way out, and I'm just going to tuck them into the hole. And then from the right side, I'm going to push them back out again. So now my needles are on the correct side of the fabric. For this side, I'm just going to do the other end as well. I'm going to pull my needles almost all the way out, but not quite. And I'm going to put them through the hole there. Oh, I lost a stitch. There we go. And push them back in. There we go. And again, if I just started knitting my thumb or my heel from here, I would end up with a gap at each end. So I'm going to use the tip of each needle to pick up one more stitch on this end, rotate, and pick up one more stitch on this end. And there we go. Now I'm ready to distribute my stitches to more than 2 double-pointed needles, or 2 circular needles, or magic loop with 1 long needle, whatever is your preference to finish up your heel or your thumb. So that is called the peasant heel with the waste yarn. The first method we looked at was an afterthought heel with no waste yarn, no planning ahead for where the thumb or the heel should go. Now, the way that I adapted this for a shawl pattern is kind of weird looking, admittedly. So what I did, and you end up with this 3-dimensional thing in the middle here. So this shawl starts at 1 tip, and you increase to the middle, and then you insert that waste yarn on half the stitches, but instead of doing a few stitches in the middle of a row, I'm actually doing all the way to the end here, to the edge. So I put half of my stitches on waste yarn in this middle row here. And then I continued with the other half of the shawl decreasing back to this point. So because I've got increases on this side and decreases on this side, it doesn't really want to lay flat. It's sort of, it's 3-dimensional right now, but it's not going to be. So when I go to remove that waste yarn, let me grab my needles here. Again, needles a couple sizes smaller than what I worked my swatch with, just so it's easier to pick up my stitches. And I'm going to go above and below those waste yarn stitches and pick up the right leg, or you can pick up the purl bumps from the back side. Pick up the right leg of each stitch. There we go. And rotate. And I'll pick up the right leg of each of these stitches as well. And you'll notice this is garter stitch as well. The 2 swatches that I did before were stockinette stitch, so garter stitch, you have to negotiate around those bumps from the row below as well. So once I have picked up stitches above and below the waste yarn, I'm going to, once again, use another needle. It's that end right there. Okay. I'm going to use another needle to pick out these stitches. And it's going to open up, instead of a hole in the middle of my swatch where I would put a heel or a thumb, this is actually going to open up one entire edge. Since I put the waste yarn, I use the waste yarn all the way to the end of one row. It's actually going to open up sort of a V shape at the bottom. There we go, waste yarn removed. And again, I'm going to use one of my needles to pick up one stitch at the edge, at the center where they meet, just so that I don't end up with a gap. So I'm just gonna pick up that guy right there. It doesn't really matter that much which stitch you pick up. But now I've got stitches on either needle. And look, my work lays flat now. And I can continue with this bottom portion here to make this triangular shawl. So I've knitted from I've created this shawl from one point to the opposite point with waste yarn in the center. And then I open up where that waste yarn has been and I work downward towards the 3rd point. So that is how this shawl is constructed. thank you for watching, and I hope that you learned to be creative, to not always use a technique the way it was perhaps intended when it was invented.